All right, I'm back with another pre-built PC review. This one's another iBuyPower PC, and this one's got the RTX 5080 in it. It's got the Ryzen 9 7900X, and it's got 32 gigs of DDR5 RAM. So let's crack this open and see what we've got. So I got this deal over at Best Buy, and I picked this one up for $1,950 shortly after the new year. And so hopefully this thing's still on sale by the time you guys see this. That's what it looks like for those of you that have never seen a Y40 case before. It does have a vertical mount GPU, which we'll see here shortly, but let's get to the accessories first. All right, as before on previous iBuyPower PCs I've looked at, there's the do not return to the store thing, which I always found kind of funny, because if I returned it, I'd return it to Best Buy, not to iBuyPower. And looks like there's a QR code for unpacking instructions or packing instructions for if you returned it. Looks like we've got some extra screws for power supply, extra screws for hard drives, extra screws for motherboards and SSDs. And each of these bags have a printed label on them to show you what each of these screws are for, so that's kind of nice. Combo jack for headsets or mics, and some extra zip ties and things like that. Extra M.2 screw. I don't know why they didn't put that in there along with the rest of the accessories box, but okay. Wi-Fi antenna, power cable for the PC, some M.2 standoffs. Looks like a right angle SATA and a regular SATA cable. And here's a little QR code. I don't recall seeing this in previous iBuyPower PCs that I bought. Little QR code for how to control your RGB for your PC. So it looks like it directs you to a software that you can use, or multiple softwares, I'm not sure. And then we got your standard keyboard and mouse that you get with iBuyPower PCs. Yeah, it's pretty much the same standard stuff, so I'm not gonna pull this stuff out. There's no point in it because they're pretty basic RGB keyboards and mice. Nothing special about them. So let's open this thing up. All right, so as you can see here, it says pull here to open, which means right here for the side of the case. Then you've got the sticker that points to the not GPU, because the GPU is over here, which I always found hilarious with iBuyPower's Y40 cases, because you can't mount the GPU regularly. It has to mount vertically like this. And so having this sticker here is always kind of funny. And it looks like the power button is in the on position rather than the off position, so I don't like that. But there is a sticker that covers the connector for the power supply to the power cable. And just be careful, like I've said before, and I'll say it again during the teardown, when pulling apart the glass side panel. And here's their generic quick start guide and how to take the side panel and the packaging out, but you know, it doesn't speak specifically to this case, so just be aware of that too. There we go. It looks like we've got an MSI 5080 in here. Asus motherboard, and it looks like a Crucial SSD. Securing strap that they've got that they use sometimes, especially for the Y40 cases, so you'll want to take that out. It's Velcroed. It comes right off. Let's hook this up and get inside. Take a look around inside the software for the BIOS and operating system, and then we'll run some benchmarks and do the teardown. All right, well, everything's coming on, so that's always a good sign. All right, we're in the Asus BIOS, and just remember that I'm not planning on changing any settings unless there's something weird going on. Mostly because I like to do these reviews based off of out-of-box experience. And so looks like our motherboard's a B650EM Max Gaming Wi-Fi from Asus with BIOS version 3265. And there's our Ryzen 7900X. Memory is at 32 gigs, DDR5 5200 megahertz, so a little on the lower end than I was hoping. I was hoping for 6000 or 5600, and it looks like CL is 40. And it is Expo that's enabled. CPU idle temperatures at 42, a little higher than I'd like to see it. I'd like to see it closer to about like anywhere from mid to low 30s all the way up to like 41 tops. And considering our ambient temperature is 19°C, 43 is a little on the high side. Looks like the resize bar is turned on. Our fan control looks like it's set at standard based off of the CPU temp. It looks like AIO pump is set to full. I'm not sure why they would set it to full instead of just standard. PBO is not enabled, so we'll have slightly less performance on our gaming. So let's get into Windows. All right, so as usual, it looks like they did not preload any bloatware, which is always good to see. And some of the pre-builts recently have been having the NVIDIA app on the desktop, but it looks like iBuyPower is not doing that, which I actually prefer. And let me change the display settings so that you guys can see better. Our driver version is 581.29 for the GPU. And it doesn't look like we've got any conflicts with the hardware. And there's our 7900X, our 32 gigs of RAM at 5200 megatransfers a second, CL40. And it looks like we've got a P3 Plus for the Crucial drive, a 2 terabyte drive. And there's our RTX 5080. So everything checks out. I'm gonna go off screen and do some benchmarking, and then we'll get to the teardown. All right, so now that I've finished off the benchmarks, let's take this thing apart. And just as a reminder, front panel is toolless, and I believe, if I recall correctly from the last Y40 case that I did a PC review on, it's almost all toolless. Because it is, all you got to do is pull that panel off, and there's like a little notch right here that will give you the finger space to be able to pull it out, and it is not held at the bottom, so just be careful because it could fall if you pull it too hard and you lose your grip. It is nubbed in right here, and it sits on a little bit of a rail right here. I don't know if the camera's going to catch that, but there is a slight rail along the bottom edge of the case for it to sit in. So that's kind of a nice little thing. A lot of cases just have a lip that it sits on where it can just slide right off. All right, and then back of the case similarly has a little notch right here on the back of the PC, and it is nubbed in, and it is not sitting on a rail like the front panel is, but it is it's got some tabs at the bottom right here, and there's a little some filtration right here, but it doesn't look like it's removable on the back panel, but that's for the fans on the side right here. And then similarly, the top panel should come right off. There's a little notch right here to get finger hold. You just pull up, comes right out, nubbed right in. And again, this has filter on the top that is not removable, which is a little unfortunate. It's more unfortunate on the top than on the back side, because as I've said before in other reviews, not being able to take that filter off creates more resistance for an exhaust set AIO or fans, which this one is set for exhaust. And so that creates more resistance, right? So not enough where it's going to be of major concern, but enough where it's just not optimal. All right. There are some concerns immediately that pop to mind, but we'll talk about that later as we go through the case. Let's first and foremost take the GPU out, which is an MSI 5080. Okay. Release right there, which is kind of nice that, you know, it's easily accessible for the release tab. Let's take this power cable off. There we go. You need this riser cable. It comes with a Y40 case if you bought the case by itself, because that's the only orientation that you can put the GPU, and we'll put that to the test. But there looks like you might be able to orient the GPU directly to the motherboard without the riser cable, but we'll take a look at that. This GPU is the MSI, I want to say it's the Inspire 5080 from the look of it. Let me take a look. Yeah, it is the Inspire 3X OC. Try to get it to the camera without it losing focus. From the things I've seen of other reviews, the cooling on this is supposed to be pretty good, especially compared to like the Shadow or the Ventus 3. Good looking card. I like the kind of a semi-champagne metal look. It is a metal back plate and metal shroud for the fans. So that's nice. I always like it when it's a metal back plate instead of plastic, which I believe like the Shadow and your base models from like Asus and Gigabyte and ASRock, they have plastic back plates on their base models. Actually, you know, if you compare it to, this is the MSI Shadow, and this is definitely a plastic back plate. This is a 5080. And so the Inspire is slightly smaller. It's about the same thickness, but it's slightly shorter. And I want to say, yeah, and slightly thinner too, as far as the width is concerned. As you can see here, there's an edge right there where the Shadow is. So it's a smaller form factor, but it has better cooling according to the reviews. I got a couple of screws right there. Okay, hit that release tab, pull it up and out. There's your riser cable. All right, so let's check all the cables, make sure everything is secure. Okay, everything's secure. So one of the things that immediately concerned me was how far down the fans are for the AIO, because it kind of blocks the RAM sticks right here. It also blocks access to the EPS cables for the CPU power, which sits at the top corner of the motherboard right here. If the RAM is tabbed in at the top and bottom of the DIMMs, that makes it really difficult to pull those out or put new sticks in, which is a little bit concerning. They put in some access holes right here, so that's nice, just in case that's the case. But this particular motherboard, I don't think these are release tabs at the top end. This is unfortunate though right here for cable management. So if you take it apart, not install the AIO first, so that you have proper access to plug in the EPS cable right here. Okay, we've got some A-Pacer RAM Panther DDR5. I don't know if you can hear that, but it sounds like it's the heat spreader's a little on the loose side. Maybe it's, yeah, I think it's the top right here where you have a diffusion right here for the RGB. So just like it said in the BIOS, actually take a picture of it to enlarge it because it's really hard to read. But this is a 5200 CL40 kit, which is what it was set for in Expo. Okay, so that slides out pretty easy, but the problem isn't that. The problem is putting it back, because the top of this hits the bottom of these fans right here. And so you might have to, if you've already got the AIO in, you'll have to kind of angle it in and then gently nudge it into where it sits straight up and down, and then you can push down on it. So you just got to finagle it a little bit if the AIO's in. All right, so access to the AIO pump is a little bit on the rough side because of the fans as well. These back two screws are slightly underneath this fan. I don't know if I'm going to be able to. That looks like I'm going to be able to. So it's a little bit tight to pull this off because of the pump power and RGB wires are kind of tightly managed. Okay, so the thermal paste looks okay, but there is a large amount of pump out around the sides there. Sometimes if the pressure's too hard, I mean, all you need is these screws to be snug, right? And that puts enough pressure for the cold plate and thermal paste to transfer the heat from the IHS of the CPU. You don't need it to be massively screwed down ultra tight, just snug. And sometimes if you screw down too hard, you can get an extraordinary amount of pump out. You're going to get pump out one way or the other, but you'll get a large amount of pump out if you over tighten. So just keep that in mind. All right, but other than that, nothing of concern. There seems to be enough thermal paste on there, and during benchmarking, I didn't see any concerns on the CPU. All right, so we're going to put this back on. So let's check the screws. Probably a quarter turn to half a turn loose. It was pretty, it was decently loose. No pressure, and it started unscrewing. Okay, let me take that SSD out. Okay, and this is the P3 Plus from Crucial, and it's a 2 terabyte NVMe. I'll take a look at the read-write speeds and I'll put them right there. Let's check the back for the screws for the fans, the rear exhaust fan, and the screws for the power supply. Okay, those are secure. The AIO securing screws. Oh, that one was loose by probably 3/4 of a turn. Oh, that one was loose by about 3/4 of a turn. And that one was loose by about a half a turn. Let's see if we can fit that GPU in here. Yeah, there's no room to position it where it can slot in, and this tab fits in through right here so that it can slot down. In order to be able to do that, you'd have to be able to remove this, which you can't. No, that looks like it's riveted in. Yeah, those are rivets right there, not screws, unfortunately. And because those are riveted in, you can't. So, you know, if it was Lee and Lee, if Lee and Lee had made this case, they would have probably made something like this, removable, right? Modular. Not going to be able to fit that in directly to the motherboard if that's your preference for how a GPU sits. So you would have to, in order to orient your GPU this way, you would have to get a different case. You can't do it here. At least, not that I can tell. If you guys have other ideas, then feel free to write down in the comments and let me know. So let's take a look at the back. Okay, well, cable management seems pretty good. While I'm thinking about it, let's check these fan screws. Fans are good. And it looks like there is both a fan and RGB hub. It looks almost like it's proprietary. The cable management, like I said, it looks fine. I don't know that I would have routed the EPS cable like this. There is a tie point right there, and there is room to have gone through this channel and down and over, which would have freed up this area instead of having a kind of a tight space, because this is, I believe, a tray to mount SSDs onto, right? And so, yeah, kind of counterintuitive. There's a bottom fan right here, which is, I don't remember that fan being there last time I did a Y40 case. Although that fan that's at the bottom, I believe it's set to, yeah, it's set to intake. But if you look right here, you'll see that there's not a lot of airflow for it. So it might be just a self-defeating positioning of a fan. And while I'm thinking about it, this case has negative airflow. You got these two intakes right here, and then the pretty well, like 90, maybe 95% blocked fan right here at the bottom. That's intake. So you got 3 intake fans. Technically, you've got maybe 2.2, 2.1 fans. And then you got 3 exhausts at the top for the AIO and an exhaust at the back. So that is 3 versus 4, so you get negative pressure. I'm not seeing a hard drive cage or anything. It looks like there would have been room if not for that bottom mounted fan. And looking at the bottom, looks like we have technically removable filters. Yeah, this filter is removable. Oh, it goes this way. All right, which, yeah, you could have just made 2 feet like the same way, where it goes like this, and then this is poor design too. I think you're not gonna you don't get more stability this way. So then why not mirror the footing like that so that you can pull the filters out in the same direction? All right, enough said on that. So when I was talking about the filter blocking exhaust, in this scenario, because it's negative pressure, it might be okay for that filter to exist to block at least some of that dust out, but it's also going to keep dust in, right? So let's unscrew the power supply. I am not familiar with this company, called Light On. It says it's 80 plus gold. Camera's not going to be able to pick this up because the print's so small, but I took a closer look. It is an 850 watt power supply. with 849 plus watts on the 12-volt rail. So supposedly it's pretty efficient. If any of you guys have ever seen or used a power supply from Light-On, please write down in the comments and let me know. I'm assuming it's a very budget-oriented kind of unknown, vague power supply company. All right, on the rear I/O of the Asus B650EM Max gaming motherboard, at the top you've got an HDMI port, and next to it is the display port. Of note is none of the documentation for Asus, even on their website for this particular motherboard, does it state what versions these ports support for both HDMI and DisplayPort, which is a little bit disappointing and a little bit too vague. I'm actually really unhappy with Asus. Back in the 90s, early 2000s, I liked them, but nowadays not so much. So right underneath the HDMI port, you've also got the BIOS flashback button. Next to the BIOS flashback button and right below that, you have 5 USB 2.0 Type A ports. Below that, you've got the blue ports, the USB Type A blue ports, which are 5 gigabits per second. And then next to that, you've got your Ethernet port or your LAN port. Unfortunately, it's just 1G for the Ethernet port instead of 2.5 or 5, which is really unfortunate. Below these, you've got a USB Type-C port that's good for 10 gigabits per second. And next to that is a USB Type-A port. That's the teal colored one. That's also 10 gigabits per second. Below that, you've got your Wi-Fi 6 connectors. And below that, you've got your audio jacks. You got your mic on the left, line out in the middle, and line in on the right-hand side. And no SPDIF on this motherboard. For the front I/O for the case, you've got your headphone mic combo jack. And then on either side of the power button that is in the center, you've got 2 USB 3.0 Type A's. And then on the far right, you have a USB Type-C 3.2. Also, I forgot to mention that there is a second M.2 slot just below the CMOS battery. And there is a third, believe it or not, M.2 slot, but it's unfortunately on the bottom part of the back of this motherboard, which means that, as you can see here, you can't reach it without taking the motherboard off. So yeah, that's useless for most people who don't want to take apart their PC but have a third SSD that they'd love to install. All right, so that's it for the teardown. I'm going to go off screen and put everything back together, and then I'll be back with benchmark results and my thoughts on the PC. All right, so let's get to the benchmarks, and we'll start with Cyberpunk 2077 at ultra settings, no RT, no frame gen, no upscaling. At 4K, we did 74.8 average FPS with 1% lows at 56.4. At 1440p, we did 150.6 FPS on average with 1% lows at 89.3. We're slightly CPU bound at that resolution, with an average GPU utilization of 88%. At 1080p, we did 167.8 average FPS with 1% lows at 91.6. Definitely CPU bound at that resolution, where our average GPU utilization was at about 73%. The top CPU temperature on that run was 81.3 C with a top power draw of 166.7 watts. The top GPU temperature came in at 70.8 C with the VRAM temperature topping out at 68 C, and top power draw was 353.6 watts. And we did Black Myth Wukong at cinematic settings, no RT, no frame gen, and upscaling was minimized at the TSR setting of 25. At 4K, we did 88.6 on average FPS with 1% lows at 71.8. At 1440p, we did 100.6 on average FPS with 1% lows at 81.5. And at 1080p, we did 109.6 average FPS with 1% lows at 88.3. Top CPU temperature came in at 72.3 C with a top power draw of 135.7 watts. Top GPU temperature came in at 68.2 C with top VRAM temperature at 68 C and the top power draw for the GPU at 284.7 watts. Then we did Monster Hunter Wilds, no RT, no frame gen, and scaling was at 100, mostly because when you have it below 100, you get a lot of blurring assets, and so 100 seemed to be the sweet spot to keep it at the minimum. At 4K, we did 64.7 average FPS with 1% lows at 42.7. At 1440p, we did 90.2 average FPS with 1% lows at 52.9. We were slightly CPU bound at 1440p. We're getting into the high 80s to the low 90s on average GPU utilization. At 1080p, we did 95.8 average FPS with 1% lows at 51.4, and we're definitely CPU bound at 1080p, where our average GPU utilization was hovering between the 70s and 80s. The CPU temperature topped out at 80.1 C, and the top power draw for the CPU was at 163.8 watts. The top GPU temperature came in at 69.9 C with the top VRAM temperature at 68 C, and the top power draw for the GPU came in at 296.8 watts. And we did 3D Mark Steel Nomad benchmark. At 4K, we did 85.5 average FPS with 1% lows at 76.7. At 1440p, we did 164.1 average FPS with 1% lows at 137.6. And at 1080p, we did 239.4 average FPS with 1% lows at 191. The top CPU temperature for that run came in at 86C with the top power draw for the CPU at 163.7 watts. The top GPU temperature came in at 71.4 C with the top VRAM temperature coming in at 70 C, and the top power draw for the GPU was 362.9 watts. Then we used a Blender 4.5.0 benchmarking tool for both the CPU and the GPU. The CPU samples per minute for Monster came in at 186.5. For Junk Shop, it came in at 129.7. And for Classroom, it came in at 100.4. For the GPU samples per minute, Monster came in at 4431.8 samples per minute. Junk Shop came in at 2396.6. Classroom 2309.1. The top CPU temperature for that run came in at 87.4 C with top power draw of 198.3 watts. The top GPU temperature came in at 60.2 C. The top VRAM temperature came in at 66 C. And the top power draw for the GPU was 229.7 watts. Then I used the Shotcut video editor to test out exporting of filtered videos. The long video was 20 minutes long and the short video is 5 minutes long, and the export time for the long video, interestingly enough, came in at an average of 15 minutes 23 seconds, and it felt like it was on the high side from other results I've had in the past, and so I tested it 5 more times on top of it, and it verified at around that. The short video export came in at 3 minutes 39 seconds, which was a little bit on the longer side too. Usually we're looking at the high 2-minute mark to the low 3-minute mark. The top CPU temperature for that run came in at 77 C with the top power draw of 110.8 watts. The top GPU temperature for that run came in at 35 C with top VRAM temperature of 46 C and the top power draw of 51.7 watts. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the things I found. So the BIOS version that this PC came with was version 3265, which was dated June of 2025. but the most current version available at the time of filming was version 3602, which was dated December of 2025, so about a 6-month spread there. And it was 4 versions later than the version that was loaded on it. 6 months is a little long. That usually gets me worried. 3 months, 4 months, okay, I can see that happening. 1 or 2 versions behind, I can see that happening. But 6 months and 4 versions behind, that's a little bit long. Nothing majorly concerning, but if you want a little bit less sound, which we'll get to here in a little bit, then you might want to, as you can hear, the fans are kicking on. You might want to play around with the fan controls a little bit to better manage the sound if that's a thing for you. I also got a sound meter recently because I wanted to start testing how the sounds are for the PC's review. The sound that the PC made at startup was topped out at 42 decibels. At idle, it topped out at 33 decibels. When I was doing some gaming, the PC topped out at 50 decibels. The loudest it got specifically during exporting some videos, that came in at about like 54 decibels. When I ran a GPU stress test, it topped out at 51 decibels. And when I used a CPU stress test, which was Cinebench R23, it topped out at 60 decibels. The GPU driver that was preloaded on this was version 581.29, which was dated September of 2025. The most current version at the time of filming was 591.74, which was dated early January of 2026, which is 9 versions later than what was preloaded on here. So although it's a little borderline, right? Especially, I worry about it mostly because there are some versions of NVIDIA's drivers that can be somewhat unstable. It is something that you want to be aware of, and maybe once you figure out what version drivers you have for your GPU, look up that version and maybe search for any known bugs or problems with that version, and then maybe even look for the most stable version. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about some of the things I found. I'm not going to repeat myself on some of the stuff that I found. You can refer back to the teardown on some of that stuff. Major concern for me was how low the fans on the AIO sits in relation to how the motherboard sits, for a couple of reasons. One, it gives you tougher access to the RAM sticks, so you kind of have to finagle a little bit to get those RAM sticks out and put them back in. Luckily, the release tabs for your DIMM slots are just at the bottom of the DIMM slots. Some motherboards have them at the top and bottom, but this particular one has them at the bottom, so that made it a little bit nicer. Plus, there's a hole at the top of the case to be able to reach the top if the release tabs did exist at the top. Also, you have very limited space between the GPU riser that's slotted into the PCIe slot and where the SSD sits. And so if you have thicker hands and or fingers, it might be a little bit tough to gain access to that SSD because it is screwed down. The other thing that I didn't like about it was that there's no heatsink for the SSD. And so you could run into some throttling issues or even instability if that SSD gets too hot. And so once you start getting around 80C or above, you could experience some instability. So just be aware of that. You might want to get a heatsink for it, or at least a thermal pad. Because of that riser cable and the way the GPU is oriented vertically, you have very limited access and possible usability of the other PCIe slots. So adding cards like for extra storage, or capture card if you're like recording some streams and things like that, you might have problems with for this kind of build. So just be aware of that, because there's very little room to work in. if it were me, I'd probably replace that AIO. iBuyPower's AIOs are not famous for doing really well, although I didn't see any problems with the CPU temperatures. I'm not a big fan of how those hoses are sitting. It kind of looks weird and a little sloppy, right? So that kind of gets on my, starts triggering my OCD a little bit. It's a decent performing PC. I was a little disappointed in how it performed on video exports. For the fact that I bought it at $2,000, and I believe it was like right at the beginning of the year when I got it, with a 5080 and a 7900X and 32 gigs of RAM and a 2 terabyte SSD. That's pretty decent value, even if we're looking at how the market was before all the craziness with SSD prices and RAM prices. And now it looks like GPUs are going to start going up too. $2,000 for this PC, actually it was $1,950 before tax. It's a pretty good price. Anywhere from $1,900 to $2,000, that's a decent buy. Even back then, you would have been hard pressed to pay less than $2,100 to $2,200. So, and this comes with a 1-year parts and labor warranty. Now, in today's market, the way current prices are and the way that pre-built PC prices are probably going to start going up if they haven't already, you're probably looking closer about a good price at about $2,200 to $2,400, somewhere around there. $2,300 to $2,400, that's kind of borderline for me. And so, like I said in some previous videos about RAM prices, I'm not a fan of encouraging that poor behavior of the prices that these companies are charging. And so if you're at $2,300 to $2,400 for a PC like this, that's borderline. If you're above $2,400, I wouldn't get it. Let me know down in the comments what you think, or if you got any questions, feel free to ask. I'm always happy to help as much as I can. And in the meantime, thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you in the next one.